Well, without more ado, let me just welcome our speaker here this evening. Is Professor Peter Harrison. As you know, he's actually one of our grant holders. Peter is Director of the Centre for the History of European Discourses at the University of Queensland. He arrived from Brisbane this morning at 5:30 a.m. after, I think, about a 30-hour journey. Plunged straight into, as he was just telling me, straight into a conference at Trinity College, which happens to be going on for the day, just to keep awake. And it's still awake, amazingly. So I think we want to especially thank Peter for giving us the opening lecture after this sort of epic voyage. Peter is certainly no stranger to the UK. He's been the holder of the Idris Professor, the Idris Chair of Science Religion at Oxford for many years, and then he went back to Brisbane quite recently. He's published some great books in the area of the history of ideas, philosophy, and also science religion. I've read quite a few of them and greatly appreciated them. I haven't read all of them, life is too short, but I'm sure that some of them will be on our bookstore afterwards. And recently he's given lectures which will be published next year by the Chicago University Press, entitled Science, Religion and Modernity, and I greatly look forward to that particular book. I should say also that Peter is an old friend of the Barrett Institute, having spoken at many of our courses and events and so on, and so it's great to welcome him back here to Cambridge. And today he's going to speak to us, suitably enough, for a college where, of course, Darwin is all around us, on the topic Biology and Worldviews, from Natural Theology to the Evolutionary Ethics. So thanks very much indeed, Peter.
Well, thanks, Dennis, for that welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. Cambridge is my second favourite UK university. I always think the after-dinner gig is quite a difficult one to entertain the troops and keep them awake. But and I know that some of you are suffering from jet lag, but as Dennis has explained, I'm in the same boat. And there is a consolation, as Dennis has said, there is a drinks reception after for those of you who can stay awake. So I'm going to talk about biology and worldviews. I know not all of you have had dinner at this particular college, but for those of you who have, if you glance to your left as you came in, you would have seen represented in stained glass these two individuals. And if you missed it, if you look straight ahead in the dining hall, the two portraits on the right are these two guys as well. And I'm not going to ask you who they are, because not many of you will know. But on the left is William Paley, and on the right is Charles Darwin. Both were members of this college. And there's a sense in which these two people represent the sorts of worldviews, respectively, that we're going to be looking at tonight. Paley, the great author of natural theology, and Darwin, the author of a theory of evolution. And both of these, in a sense, were elevated into significant worldviews, and to some extent, we might think these worldviews are in collision. There are their names, and as I say, I thought at one stage that I might build this whole talk about ex-members of Christ's College, because a few other characters will get a mention along the way, but that it would actually have been, it was too big a stretch. But I'm going to talk tonight about these four areas. I'm going to talk first of all in very general terms about what counts as a use and abuse of biology, just to try and get that straight. And these last three topics are really, in essence, about the identity of biology. So the whole talk is structured around uses and abuses on the one hand, and on the other hand, what counts as biology. And as you'll see, there's a terminological difference that natural history in the 19th century becomes biology. And that shift that we see in the nomenclature from natural history to biology has some very interesting implications for what happens to the worldviews that are packaged along in those two different conceptions of what counts as the study of nature. So I'm going to start with uses and abuses. And it's pretty obvious that one of the reasons we study biology is precisely that it has lots of uses, and there are many good uses of biology, many things that we wouldn't want to be without. This one in particular, when I read reports of pre-19th century operations, I always think this is a really incredible use of biology. And antibiotics are another one. Capacity to increase food yields is another one. Our ability to farm fish, for example, another wonderful use of biology. So in the broad context of uses and abuses of biology, there's nothing really controversial about the uses of biology. The question, though, is what's the point at which these particular applications might turn into abuses? And in this country, I know many people are exercised by the genetic engineering of food products. So that potentially is, for some, an abuse. We can think also of reproductive technologies applied to, well, human reproduction. These things also have the potential to be controversial at the very least. And again, human cloning is another example of something that at least is an application of biology that is, we can ask the question at least, uses or abuses. So what makes something a use and what makes it an abuse? And I guess this comes down simply to the moral question of whether the applications are ones that we regard as morally acceptable. So that's one kind of way of thinking about abuses. And if we look forward to future scenarios, one signal for a potential abuse is an application of biology that might lead to societies that we might consider to be undesirable. And there are many dystopian sci-fi movies that tell about futures in which we have unpleasant scenarios that arise out of particular applications of biology. And the broad question we can ask is, are these the kinds of worlds that we would want to live in? And if they're not, then we might say this thing would count as an abuse of biology. If we look back instead of looking forward, we get, I think, what seem to be much more clear-cut instances of abuses of biology. And I'll just use one example. Scientific racism is a clear case in point. And this is where we have scientific justifications for racial difference, racial differentiation, and indeed, we might say, a hierarchical typing of human races. So to give you an example, the Dutch 18th century scholar Peter Camper invented craniometry, where he attempted to measure, with some success, the volume of skulls and used his measurements of skull volume to make racial distinctions and to invent a racial hierarchy. Another measurement that he used was the cranial angle, which is really to do with, if you look at the three cases here on your left, you can see an increasing cranial angle as we go down. So cranial angle then was taken to be a measure of racial superiority. Samuel George Martin, 19th century American physician, did something very similar. And if you want the stats, he concluded that Caucasians have the biggest brains because their cranial cavities measure 87 cubic inches. Indians are in the middle with 82 cubic inches, and Africans, he said, had the smallest brains with an average of 70 cubic inches. Now, the experiments have been repeated and the results aren't altogether clear, but what we have here is a clear instance of an application of biology to a claim that today we would regard as unacceptable. And here we have a more sinister 20th century instance of the same kind of thing. Not unrelated to this is the project of eugenics, which is to say selective breeding, which is one application of evolutionary theory to our ideas of human, let's put it this way, human breeding. One famous advocate of this was Charles Darwin's half-cousin Francis Galton. And let me just read a quote from him. "It is in the most unqualified manner that I object to pretensions of natural equality. The experiences of the nursery, school, university, and of professional careers are a chain of proofs to the contrary." He goes on to say, "One of the effects of civilization is to diminish the rigour of the application of the law of natural selection. It preserves weakly lives that would have perished in barbarous lands." So, Francis Galton inspired eugenics programs, most notoriously in the United States. And there's a famous movie called The Black Stork that was put together by a Chicago physician in the wake of his having allowed a severely disabled newborn to die. So eugenic programs, including things like compulsory sterilisation, were set up in a number of states in the US. The Second World War brought a quick end to most forms of scientific racism. But the point here is that when we look back, we see clear instances of what seem to be abuses of biology, and it seems to me that one of the questions we might ask is, when people in 100 years' time look back, are there things going on today that they may regard in a similar light to these kinds of practices? And I don't have a view one way or the other about that, but I put the question. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind with these instances that I've used here is that it's not merely the application of scientific theories. In the case of eugenics, you do have an application of the theory of natural selection, but in the previous cases, you have an application of scientific methodology. So what made the racism scientific was the measurement and the use of statistics. So even free of scientific content, the abuse in the first case consisted of the application of what seemed to be scientific methods. So one obvious instance of what's going to be an abuse of science is where you have an abuse of science or of biology that contravenes a basic ethical principle. The other case that I want to talk about, and this is going to be the main focus of the talk this evening, is where we have instances of biology being applied outside the natural boundaries of the discipline. And I'm just going to give you a few examples, and then I'm going to talk about the history of the boundaries of science, because if we're talking about applications outside the boundaries, then we need to ask questions about what the boundaries are and how we arrive at them. So natural selection is applied to culture, memes and memetics. The idea of memes has been around for a while, but in essence it is the application of a gene-based theory of natural selection to cultural change, and it uses the analogy of the gene as a unit that's subject to natural selection in biology to various things that appear in the culture. One example might be religion as something that changes over time and evolves in a culture in much the same way that genes change in biological populations. So we have here the meme machine. Susan Blackmore is a noted advocate of memes. The Journal of Memetics. Now what can we say about these? Well, the idea that culture can be understood in biological terms is the basic principle behind this system. So we don't have to get too tied up in the specifics of memetics. But it's interesting that this notion of applying genetic theory to culture has not met with universal approbation amongst the scientific fraternity. So let me just read a few critiques. Louise Benitez Bribiesca says that memetics is, and I quote, a pseudo-scientific dogma a dangerous idea that poses a threat to the serious study of consciousness and cultural evolution. Mary Midgley, who is a famous critic of scientism in this country, says there are two problems with this view. One, culture is not best understood by examining its smallest parts. And the other thing is that there are other significant factors, history, for example, that need to be taken into account. And moreover, metacisists can be challenged as to whether memes even exist. Now, the ontological status of genes is itself problematic, far less, I think, memes. So, a simple example of how a biological theory is applied to culture as a whole. Let me give you a second example, and these are the terms of Raymond Tallis, who I see is a speaker who will be coming up for the Faraday Institute in a little while. He was on the PowerPoint that was running when we came in. But his recent book, Aping Mankind, he talks about biologism, Darwinitis, and neuromania. And this is what he says. Biologism, belief that human beings can be understood essentially in biological terms. And he goes on to say that if we want to explain everyday behaviour in Darwinian terms, we end up misrepresenting what we are. We offer a grossly simplified conception of human beings. Neuromania, he says, just to give you the specifics of that, the attempt to reduce everything in human culture to brain function. Typically we have the report in the paper, we discover the bit of the brain that looks after this, and usually there's a brain scan attached. And the rhetorical power of brain scans is something that's very interesting culturally, and a significant number of people here in the workshops have projects involving the neurosciences. So, neuromania, the application of one element of biology as an attempt to explain things that perhaps go beyond its boundaries. One final example, before I get on to the real stuff, which is the history, sociobiology, E.O. Wilson, and here's the claim here from Ed Wilson: it may not be too much to say that sociology and the other social sciences, as well as the humanities, may be the last branches of biology waiting to be included in the modern synthesis. Well, I think for many people it is too much to say. And it's interesting in this context that the use and abuse of biology as an expression appears in this title by the distinguished Chicago anthropologist Marshall Salins, who responded vigorously to the imperialistic claims of E.O. Wilson in sociobiology. And as a social scientist, he wanted to resist, on behalf of the social sciences and the humanities, attempts to reduce these much more complex elements of human culture to biology, or even the idea that it was possible. He was not the only one to do so. And here's a very long quote from a letter that was sent by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin and a number of other signatories to the New York Review of Books on the occasion of a review of Wilson's sociobiology, and you can read for yourselves what is said there. But the interesting point here is that the objections being made are not being made in this instance on behalf of people in the humanities or the average Joe Blow, but by people in the biological community themselves who are concerned at the applications of biology beyond what they might regard as its literal, or its proper boundaries. So, summing it up then, what I want to say is I think that there are two ways in which we can think about abuses of biology. Misapplication, right, where we have technologies that contravene ethical principles, and then what I've called biological imperialism, which is, as I've got there, where we take biological explanations and we expand them beyond the accepted boundaries of the discipline. And there, I guess, in its extreme form, we can say that this inflation then becomes an all-encompassing worldview. Hence, that's why I want to talk about worldviews in the title of the talk. And I've just put in bold there the things that you need to attend to. If you want to claim a misapplication contravenes an ethical principle, then of course you've got the issue of, well, how do we establish ethical principles in the first place? And that clearly is a problem. This is why certain biomedical technologies remain controversial, because the underlying, there's no underlying agreement on the moral principles, or there's no underlying agreement on which moral principles apply or how the moral principles are to be applied. And it's only where we get a clear-cut case like scientific racism, where there's fairly unambiguous agreement that racism is a bad thing, we can say we have a clear misapplication of biology. But the grey areas are really a function of the fact that it's difficult in this pluralistic age to get agreement on basic ethical principles. The other one, the expansion of biology beyond its legitimate boundaries, then raises the question of what are the legitimate boundaries of biology, because clearly there's a difference between E.O. Wilson's view of what the legitimate boundaries are. He thinks there aren't any, and other biologists, and presumably those in the humanities and social sciences who may not wish there, who may not believe that their activities can be collapsed into biological explanations. But how do we establish those boundaries? And I'm not going to give you a definitive answer to that question tonight, but what I do want to do is to have a look at the history of how that boundary question has been talked about and how it relates to worldviews. And there's one other question that I'd want to put in your heads. Is biology of the sciences especially vulnerable? Okay, is biology especially vulnerable? And if so, why is it that it's especially vulnerable in this kind of way? Okay, now I think it might be. Okay, I think it might be, but you want to think about why that might be the case. Okay, so we're going to move on now to talk about natural history and its uses. I'm going to go right back to these guys, the ancient Greeks. And this is the famous Raphael stanza where he's painted all the philosophers, and I'll pick a few out. And the first guy is Aristotle. And I'm picking out Aristotle because Aristotle had a very influential way of dividing up the intellectual territory of the sciences. And it wasn't the only one, but it lasted from his time up to the 17th century. And he spoke about natural philosophy or physics, which was the basic science of nature. Okay? It's not directly equivalent to science for reasons we'll see in a moment. Mathematics, which is pretty straightforward. And the other, I'm talking here about Aristotle's three theoretical sciences. The other theoretical science for Aristotle was theology. That's not much to do with nature, so I'll take that one off and give you two more categories of knowledge that Aristotle used. Mixed mathematics, really just applied maths as far as we're concerned, and natural history, which in Greek, for the Greeks, was the descriptive study of nature, but it didn't give you causes in the way that natural philosophy did. So, very broadly speaking, if you want to say for the Greeks, and indeed for much of the late Middle Ages and the early 17th century, the study of nature was divided between two main disciplines, natural philosophy and natural history. Okay? And they look a bit like they're equivalent to physics and biology, but for reasons I'll show you in a moment, they weren't. Let me give you some definitions about the uses of physics or natural philosophy from some of the ancient thinkers. And I'm going to start here with Simplicius, who's giving a commentary on Aristotle's physics. And he says, physics, or physiologia, is useful. So here's the question of the uses of this term. And it's a question that's asked way back. And he says it's useful in the affairs of daily life, gives us the principles of technology, such as medicine and mechanics. Above all, he says, understood as the art of manufacturing machines of war. But here's the interesting bit. He goes on to say, but because it contributes the superior part of the soul, etc., etc. It's an auxiliary for moral virtues, and it's a ladder that leads towards knowledge of God and ideas. It incites us to piety and do acts of thanksgiving towards God. So the idea of the study of physics was, at a very basic level, it was useful for the practical stuff, but beyond that, it had a moral purpose, and it leads us on to much higher things. So there's a worldview here entailed in the very notion of what it was to be engaged in natural philosophy or physics. It was a whole package, and that's what the purpose of the study of nature was. The useful stuff, yes, but also this whole moral component. And I'm just going to give you a couple more examples to show you that Simplicius is not the only guy arguing this, although it's very clear. So here's Plato, and the bit in bold is the key thing. So in the Republic, in the Timaeus, I should say, that's the book he's holding there, although you can't quite read the title. To cut a long story short, he says, the reason we study the regularities of nature is so that we can imitate them, and in imitating these regularities of nature, we attain the best life that's possible. So the study of nature is integrated into a philosophical package that aims at arriving at the good life. And even a philosopher like Epicurus, who we tend to associate with college dinners and so on, says, this is why we're studying nature. Knowledge of the facts of life, he says, relieves us from the burden of superstition, etc., 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 frees us from the fear of death. So the ultimate aim of the study of nature, although it may have practical spin-offs, is this moral thing. Okay? Now, I don't want to keep labelling it, but I'll give you one more. Ptolemy. Ptolemy is the guy who comes up with the brilliant mathematics of the medieval world system. Says, look, with regard to virtuous conduct and practical actions, mathematical astronomy, above all things, makes us see clearly, etc., 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 and reforms our natures to a spiritual state. So this is why natural philosophy is not the same as modern science, okay? Because natural philosophy starts with practical applications, but for these guys, the more important elements are the things that appear down the track, which are the reforming of the human life. Now, when Christianity appears on the scene, Christianity as a tradition, in essence, takes over the moral functions that once had been part of the natural philosophical tradition. And that then leaves natural philosophy largely with a set of practical applications. But there were exceptions. But the point here is that both ancient thinkers and medieval Christian thinkers are asking about the uses of natural history and natural philosophy. And here's the 5th century church thinker Augustine, and he's going to talk about the uses of biology. In this context, they help us understand the Bible. That's why we study biology. Or Bartholomeus Anglicus, he's the author of a very influential medieval encyclopedia, argues the same thing. The reason we study natural history, he says, is that it helps us understand the Bible. So the question of the uses of biology is an age-old biology. Well, it's an age-old question if we talk about the study of nature. And I said the study of nature is not quite biology yet, it's natural philosophy and natural history. But there's a significant moral and theological component. In the 17th century, this takes on a particular and distinctive shape. And so I'm now going to talk about natural history and natural theology in the 17th century. And this brings me to our third Christ College Fellow, Edward Topsell. And the image you see there are better images, but this is actually the version of Topsell's History of Four-Footed Beasts that's in Christ College Library. The creature on the front, you might be able to read it. It's a gorgon, right? And the gorgon was the fearsome monster, right? This looks like a sheep with a skin problem and having a bad hair day. But anyway, apparently this is what he thought the gorgon looked like. But in his History of Four-Footed Beasts, again, he's talking about natural history, a history of the beasts, a description of the beasts. And what he wants to say is this has an essentially religious function. So the knowledge of the creatures and the works of God is divine. That's why we study it. He goes on to say, every beast, every creature is a natural vision that we ought to see and understand for the more clear apprehension of the invisible majesty of God. So one of the prime motivations for the study of nature, and people then as now want to have justifications for the pursuit of knowledge, and justification for the pursuit of natural history is its theological implication at this point in time. The classic work of the 17th century is John Ray's book, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. And this then is a classic work of natural theology, and by natural theology I simply mean the study of nature to derive certain basic truths about God, his existence, his wisdom, his goodness, typically, okay, his power. So the study of nature is tied up, inextricably tied up, with this natural theological project. And it's not just that the study of nature gives us proofs for the existence of God. It's not just an apologetic exercise, but rather at the heart of natural history is a theological project that gives it its coherence and its justification. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. Here's Plouche's famous Spectacle of Nature, a work that went to a number of volumes. But the key thing here is that his argument that what gives the study of nature its coherence, what makes it hang together as a discipline, is the idea that it's the work of God. So the justification for the study of nature is that it tells us about God, but more than that, what makes it coherent as a discipline is the fact that it has this underpinning that makes it all hang together. And now we get to the third most famous fellow of Christ. Darwin is the most famous. I think John Milton the second, and probably William Paley, I think, are the third. I give him third place, right? And again, we get the idea that there's a uniformity of plan that we see in nature. Okay, so again, the natural theological enterprise is not simply about giving arguments for God's existence, but seeing biology, as we would now call it, as having this uniformity and intelligibility that comes from this basic principle of design. And I'm going to give you one more example, and I'll come back to Darwin. And this is John Herschel. John Herschel, again, you've got his dates there. He's early 19th century. His account of inductive philosophy was strongly influential on Darwin's conception of how natural history was to be pursued. But here is his view about natural philosophy. He says the natural philosopher is led to the conception of a power and intelligence superior to his own, etc., etc. And then we get this wonderful quote that's almost, I won't say word for word, but it's strongly reminiscent of what Ptolemy was saying about the study of the heavens, that by observing the regularities of nature, we get this tranquilization and reassurance of the mind. So the study of nature has this strong moral effect on us. And again then, one of the reasons we study nature, one of the uses of the study of nature is that it gives us this, it has the capacity to inculcate in us particular moral properties. So as I've said, Herschel is a significant influence on Darwin. Darwin says in his autobiography that Herschel inspired him with a burning zeal to contribute to science. And I think part of this entailed Herschel's moral vision. It's very interesting that the two most powerful influences on Darwin while he was here at Christ's were John Henslow and Adam Sedgwick. And both of these figures argued that, similarly to Herschel, that the study of biology, in Sedgwick's case the study of geology, had to have a moral purpose, and they regarded these disciplines as part of what we would say is a liberal arts education. That was the justification for pursuing these disciplines. Now that was going to change, excuse me, all of that changes significantly in the 19th century. And it's in the 19th century that we get our first uses of the word biology. No one talks about biology until the beginning of the 19th century. But interestingly, we also get our first conceptions of science in our modern sense, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And we get the emergence of an idea of the evolutionary epoch. I'm going to talk about all of those right now. So the Oxford English Dictionary is just a fantastic place if you're wondering when the first people used the word in a particular way. And people first used the word science in the way with which we're familiar in the late 19th century. Let's go with the mid-19th century. Thanks for that. And we've got Ward here in the Dublin Review in 1867 talking about Englishmen are starting to use science in this particular way, and the particular way in which they're using it is as expressing physical and experimental science, and here's the key part, to the exclusion of the theological and the metaphysical. So we've had a tradition of the study of nature from Aristotle to the middle of the 19th century that includes in that study of nature metaphysical, theological, moral principles, and now we have a conception of science that's being used and it's excluding the theological and the metaphysical. And science then becomes the term that replaces natural philosophy. And people no longer talk about natural philosophy, they talk about science. And indeed they will no longer increasingly talk about natural history, but rather they will talk about biology, and biology will have very similar implications. And let me just put the stats up for you. So here are the uses of the term natural philosophy in the black, and the use of the term natural sciences in the grey, and you can see the inverse relation there. And what I'm suggesting to you here is we're not just looking at one word replacing another, but we're looking at a new conception of what is entailed by the study of nature. And it's a new conception where the theological, the moral and the metaphysical are dropping out of the picture. And the study of nature is no longer philosophical, but it's scientific in the new sense. And we get a very, very similar picture looking at the frequency of these terms, biology and natural history. We can see biology just shooting up there. The reason why natural history hangs around is we've got museums of natural history, we've got shows about natural history on the telly, but as a scientific activity, it's not clear that natural history survives in a significant sense into the 20th century. So the interesting question here then is, the point I'm trying to make is that the study of nature up to this point seemed to be involved in a worldview that entailed elements of morality and philosophy and metaphysics, if you like, and theology. And now we have a different conception that excludes those. But the sorts of examples that I've shown you earlier with people like Wilson and others, it seems to me at least that there are vestiges of the older conception that continue along into and are carried over into modern biology and to some extent into modern science. And that's the argument I want to make just in these last few minutes of the talk. Let me go first of all to this guy. And this is probably the most famous passage in all of the Origin. You can read it for yourselves. The by the creator is in square brackets because that didn't appear in, as Darwin's scholars know as a commonplace, that did not appear in the first edition, but it did appear in the second and through to the 6th edition, I think. Is that right, John? Yes. Okay, so Darwin thought he'd better pop that in. But the point I'm trying to make here is that right at the end of this great work, Darwin now wants to reflect on, are there implications that go beyond the mere biological in what I've talked about here? And this is classic part of the natural history tradition that he's put in here, that the idea that there is a view of life, okay, there is a view of life here, that in which there's some degree of grandeur. And the other interesting thing that I want to draw your attention to is the planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity. And what's implied here is that this is, although we have implications of the old natural history tradition because of the worldview, what's going to make biology scientific is a law that's like gravity, and that law is the law of evolution. And just to show how this law, the idea of a lawfulness is going to make it scientific, I want to hark back to Robert Chambers, who published a famous book called The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. And this is my last Christ College Fellow reference, but Jim Secord has written a wonderful book about the history of this called Victorian Sensation. He is a fellow of this college. So that was going to be my last Christ College person I was going to build a talk around. But anyway, there it is. Get the book, it's a wonderful thing. But what Chambers says in his version, and here again we have these elements again, he's attempting to connect the natural sciences into a history of creation. He's trying to do a big picture story, and then again we get this little homily at the end. So there may yet be, I'll put it in italics there, a faith derived from this view of nature, sufficient to sustain us under all sense of imperfect happiness and so on. So the tension you've got here is that we're trying to move to a scientific conception of the study of nature, and one that leaves behind the moral, the metaphysical and theological, but these guys find it very difficult to relinquish that older worldview picture, and they smuggle it, to some extent, smuggle it in at the end, okay? So it's still propping up there as a kind of philosophy of life. And it's this story here that becomes what is known as the epic of evolution. And the epic of evolution is simply a story about the development of the cosmos and the universe and living things that takes on the attempt to convey meaning that we found in those older natural philosophical traditions going right back to, as we saw in Simplicius and Plato and in Ptolemy and so on. And just so that you can see, I haven't put the bar graph up, I've just quickly got a quick frequency of these expressions, epic of evolution and evolutionary epic. We see them kicking off there in the late 19th century. And evolutionary epic is the more common expression, but people start to, from this time on, to talk about the evolutionary epic. And the main guy to talk about it, let me give you two examples of applications of Darwinian natural selection to society before I go on and talk in more detail about evolutionary ethics. And this is Herbert Spencer, who's probably the most famous social Darwinist of all, the application of Darwinian thought to society. And there were a number of them in the 19th century. Here's an American version of the same thing, John Fiske. And both of these guys want to say Darwinism is more than a theory about evolution. It's a way of life, it's a philosophy, it's a moral system, and we can apply it to the whole of life. So again, we have, almost contemporary with Darwin, people who want to elevate evolutionary theory into a worldview in much the same way that we saw, as I said, in the natural history and natural philosophy tradition. And now I just want to talk about some of the modern examples, and we come back to E.O. Wilson, and here we've got E.O. Wilson again making the claim that biology has become the paramount science. It can absorb the other sciences into it, and indeed the humanities as well. And And here he starts to say, biology is the thing that is relevant to the basic questions of life. So if we want to know about the meaning of life, don't talk to theologians, don't talk to philosophers, certainly don't talk to postmodern literature people. Talk to a biologist, talk to us. We know what it's about. Another example, Dan Dennett. Now, Dennett is much more restrained, but you get again a clear instance of what he wants to do with this Darwinian conception of natural selection, to say, actually, this is something that applies not merely within biology, it applies universally. And not only does it apply universally, but it's like an acid that corrodes everything it touches, and it eats away all of our traditional conceptions. Now, you've heard Stephen Jay Gould and Llewellyn on E.O. Wilson. Here's Gould on Dennett. Dennett's views are an instance of, he says, Darwinian fundamentalism, and Dennett has little understanding of evolutionary theory beyond natural selection. So here you have an instance of a biologist attempting to rein in the boundaries of a biological conception that's gone wild, okay, and it's gone troppo, and he's trying to bring it back in. So my point here is that this is not, Dennett is not representative of biology, E.O. Wilson is not representative of biology. They are biologists expressing a particular view, but there are other biologists who want to police the boundaries. Now, we can't get through the lecture without mentioning this guy at least twice. So here we have Richard Dawkins, and here's his pitch that, forget the old classics, evolution is the new classics. So the basic questions about the meaning of life are to be answered by biology and by one specific theoretical conception within biology. But here is, I guess, the paradox, that for Dawkins, nonetheless, the universe exhibits no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So what he wants to do is to say, biology gives you no conception of purpose or meaning in the universe, and yet we're not going to let anyone else have that space, right? That space still belongs to us. So don't pretend that Shakespeare or maybe classical music or any form of literature or religion or any cultural product can tell us about the meaning of life. Biology talks about that, and we haven't found it. All we've got is blind, pitiless indifference, but that space belongs to us. Darwinism is the only theory that could solve the mystery of our existence. And I'll just come back to Wilson because I want to finish on talking about survivals of the myth of the evolutionary epic. So Wilson says the evolutionary epic is the best myth we will ever have. And by this he means the story of human evolution. He doesn't mean it's false in the sense of a myth. He means it's a myth in the sense of the creation myths, the things that give life meaning. And biology, he believes, can provide the myths that make life meaningful. And there's the logical extension of these conceptions occurs in a new genre of history called big history. And I'm just going to give you two examples of what big historians say. And just, if you haven't encountered this, big history is the history of everything, starting from the Big Bang, going through, well, can't go too far in the future, but the present and what we think will happen in the future. And it's the idea that history should be told on this large scale. So in his book Maps of Time, and you can see David Christian's an introduction to big history. Maps of Time, he says, what we're trying to do is to come up with a modern creation myth. And then here's the story. We teach this story, and these have the tradition of, he says, they capture what's in the traditional creation myths, but they do the job scientifically. They do the job scientifically. I'll give you one additional example, and it's right here in the title, Epic of Evolution, 7 Stages of the Cosmos by Eric Chason. And it's a long quote, but I'll put it up and I'll read it out. And I should be using the Carl Sagan Cosmos type voice, but the integrated, coherent story of cosmic evolution, a powerful and noble epic, can act as a vital intellectual vehicle to involve all our legacy. Perhaps we are indeed becoming wise, ethical, humane human beings. Perhaps we are now on the path towards ethical evolution. Many varied challenges along the future arrow of time. So, my suggestion here is that what we've got going on here is a very neat little bait and switch operation. Its objectivity, its capacity to answer the small questions really well, and OED gave us, the capacity to answer those small questions comes at the relinquishing of. What we now have is scientific claims that smuggle back in expertise in the moral sphere, the theological sphere, on the basis of credit that's been accomplished by the abandoning of those pretensions in the transitions that we saw going from natural history and natural philosophy to modern science and modern biology. And my only point here is I don't think you can have it both ways. You can't both claim scientific status and scientific objectivity and still want to make the broad value claims that were part of the natural philosophical and natural historical tradition of the past. And to do so, it seems to me, constitutes an abuse of biology. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. We're going to have a few minutes for questions before we head for our drinks. So please, we'll start right at the back. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for your talk. I learned a lot tonight. Was biology the first ology? And whatever your answer is, what do you make of it?
Okay, it wasn't the first ology because, getting right back to the Greeks, we've got the notion of the logos, and what was the first?
Theology.
Sorry?
Theology.
Theology was certainly early on, but not as early as theology is close. I'm trying to think if there's astrology. Yes, astrology. There's quite a few of them. I think what the thing with biology is it's the idea that first of all there could be a logos, which is to say a systematic causal understanding. That's part of it. As opposed to biology. No, you can't say biology. But that's it. But the theology one is interesting because theology is the term is one that Plato comes up with. Aristotle makes theology the queen of the sciences. Middle Ages they don't talk much about theology. They tend to talk about sacred doctrine. It's only when you get to Aquinas that people start to talk about identifying theology as something that's Christian. But that's a bit of a sidetrack. But the point about why biology, it's to do with both components. The logos bit to do is whether you can have a systematic study of this stuff. But the other thing is that life becomes the subject, not nature generally. And so the life's natural history had included geology. In fact, you could have a natural history of virtually anything. So biology is both an attempt to restrict the subject matter to life, which then becomes a new object of study, and it becomes a systematic thing. And when Darwin comes up with the theory of evolution, it's got a wonderful law-like thing to hang it all together. So that's why that all comes together when it does. Is that?
Yeah.
Please, up there. Come down here. Yes, you said. Yes,
so-
yes.
So you finished by saying that that we can't have it both ways, that we can't both use science, biology, and then sex independent, and also then start construing meanings. So which way would you have it?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is here's what I think the logical difficulty is, and it's a little bit like the metaphysical naturalism thing. So if scientific, so let me use naturalism as an example. If scientific method starts with a premise that we're not going to deal with any supernatural type explanations, that's the operating premise, and I think that's a fair thing. And that operating premise is methodological naturalism. Okay, we're going to deal with the sphere of nature. Then it seems to me you're not in a position to make any claims at all about metaphysics or theology, because you've methodologically ruled out your capacity to deal with those things right at the start. So if that's your starting assumption, essentially there's a logical difficulty in coming up with implications. Now I'll come back to one possible way of getting around that. It's the same too as if you say the practice that we're engaged in here is one that's essentially indifferent to, say, the moral qualities of those who are engaged in it, right? Then again, you can't, it seems to me logically, then talk about the moral implications. And there's the basic thing about, again, this is a contestable philosophical issue, but whether you can get an ought from an is part of what's going on here. And a lot of philosophers have said you can't get an ought from an is. Now, I'm not sure about that, but that's one kind of claim that you might want to see there. Now, to go back to the question about, let me go back to the methodological naturalism question. One argument might be, look, if you don't assume the existence of supernatural causation and you get a pretty good picture of reality, what's going on, why would you ever need to invoke that? Right. I think that's one way you might make that argument. Work. But as I say, I just don't think you can have it both ways, and that's why I think I will mention one more fellow of this college. I said I wouldn't, but C.P. Snow, right? And C.P. Snow, you might remember, gave the famous Reed lecture in 1959 on the two cultures, and really his problem was the science wasn't getting enough prominence, but nonetheless, the point was you needed both cultures, you needed the science and the humanities. And in a sense, my argument would be, look, it's the humanities and the arts that deal with these questions of meaning and value. Now, part of the problem here, you might say, is well, actually the humanities has dropped the bundle because of the way in which some humanities disciplines have developed, and they've given up that traditional task. Okay, but I think to go back to your question about who does what, leave the values meaningful type questions to the humanities.
Okay, we'll come down here and then we'll come around. Yeah, please, yes.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. To return to the biology, to the word, of course it's a Greek word, a rather combination of two Greek words, but this word would be completely meaningless to an ancient person. Logos is a wide term, of course. But then nature would also be quite vague. Because for Aristotle, nature was physics, but this was not nature in the sense we know nature today, we use nature today. So, what do you think? Isn't it important to clarify, firstly, the term nature, to clarify the meaning of nature? What do we mean by nature? And what does this term encompass? The physical world, plot, essence, hypostasis, substance, human nature, or what is nature? Is it brutish and bestial and all that sort of thing, you know, in the spirit of the rebellion and without matter, Hobbesian tradition, or is it good?
If there are any, you can keep giving me possible examples. Let me stop you right there. No, nature is clearly something that's culturally constructed, right? So, in other words, there are different conceptions of nature. Now, and what's interesting is that the early Greek conceptions of physis, nature is everything there is. Nature is everything. That includes the gods, the whole kit and caboodle. And what's interesting when Plato and Aristotle come along, they actually say, no, there's something beyond nature. And it's implicit in Aristotle's distinction here that theology is something that is actually beyond the natural world. But C.S. Lewis has this in a wonderful book called, forgot the name. It's about words. What's the C.S. Lewis book that's about words? Studies in words. And nature is one of the ones there. And he asks exactly these questions that you were asking, nature. He said one way is to look at the opposites of nature. And for the pre-Socratics, there's no opposite because nature is everything. But from Aristotle on, you get the possibility of something beyond nature. It's only in the Middle Ages that you get a conception of supernatural, and you see that. I don't know whether Aquinas is the first to use it, but certainly he does use it. In Peter Lombard, we get preternatural, something beside nature or beyond nature. So these distinctions are important. Aristotle's distinctions are natural and artificial, typically. The other Greek distinction is between nature and culture. Natural and violent is another Aristotelian distinction. So there's a whole range of ways in which you can set up nature in terms of its distinction. So you're exactly right to say it's ambiguous, but if you want to know what the meaning is, as a historian, I say, well, you look at the historical context, you see how people use the word, and they use it quite differently in each case. And if that's your point, yes, I certainly agree with you.
Okay, so we have lots of hands. Please, yes. Yeah.
So I have a quick question about world. What do you mean by world? And it seems to me that coherence is a clear component of this. And as you've been using it, worldview means something. It refers to something like cosmology, or the sort of a total narrative that is all encompassing. But it struck me, and I was thinking about this when you put this answer up. It strikes me that there are forms of evolutionary, if you might say, or evolutionary modalities of understanding the human and the moral nature and meaning of human action that are much, much more circumscribed and are more like hermeneutic than cosmology. And the example I'm thinking of is simply the approach in behavioral economics to sort of interrogating human action in light of an evolutionary past in which there's a kind of moral defectiveness by virtue of being in a different sort of environment and the possibility of fixing that, which strikes me as worldview-like, yet much, much more circumscribed and much, much more situated within institutions that do stuff rather than tell big stories.
Yeah, look, I think that's a good point. And I blame Dennis for this because Dennis is going to wonder where I'm heading with this. He said, I want a title for your talk. And I thought, biology and worldview. Right. And when I came to do the talk, I realised in a way the kinds of things you were talking about, that worldview is going to work, I think, for the myths, the idea of science as providing a myth worldview, that's going to map on. But you're exactly right that there are a range of ways in which you could use it that are much more restricted. And I wouldn't call those a worldview. So when Dennett talks about Darwinism as the universal absolute, is that a worldview? I think it probably is. But you can think of examples of, so my point here is that there are more abuses of biology in the sense of biological imperialism that aren't going to mean that you have a biological picture that determines your whole worldview. So there are a range of positions in between. I think that's exactly right.
John.
So I'm interested in this claim across time. I'm struck by going back to natural theology and its relationship to the present. Like sociology version of this would describe this as professional competition between the scientists who want to claim jurisdiction over this work of sending meaning for the human species versus its traditional competitor, which would be called theology. Now, this varies with time, but you didn't talk about the status of its competitor. So, for example, in the late 50s and 60s in the U.S., people like Francis Crick and Julian Huxley and Mueller tried to make a similar claim that due to the collapse of theology in their minds, biology should stand in and tell us the purpose of existence. And very quickly, prominent scientists said, stop talking like this, you're going to get us all in trouble, you're going to get our funding cut, and then that was the end of that. So I'm thinking that, if anything, in the contemporary British scene, from 1930 to present, this should be exploding, because its primary competitor in the public sphere, religion, has been on a fairly linear descent since that time. So is the story of the rise of this effort by science also explainable by the rise and decline of its primary competitor, which is theology?
It's a good question, right? And it partly goes to questions of correlation and causation. Because I think you might talk about the displacement of a set of religious explanations of meaningfulness by the assumption that science can do the job. So your suggestion is religion's fallen over and biology occupies the space. But another possible explanation, and I'm not committed to this, is that actually know that it's been a much more direct displacement of one by the other. But again, it seems to be the logical difficulty is that the very questions of meaningfulness and purpose, they don't arise in the context of biology, they arise in these other contexts. And so these questions are not native to that disciplinary context, and it just seems to be it's illogical to be mounting those questions in a context that explicitly methodologically attempts to rule them out to start with. And I guess the final thing is to ask whether you're saying secularisation in Britain has been on a upwards. Am I doing that graph the right direction? We're going up. Yeah. I think that remains controversial. On the measures of the objective measures of participation in organised religion, that's certainly the case. But I think it remains controversial as to whether that's a decline in religion in a significant way. But I leave that to the I'm happy to leave that to the sociologists.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and we're going to give priority to the public as non-workshop people, because workshop people will talk to Peter for the next 2 days. Okay, so is there anyone else who want to ask a question? Yeah, please, sir. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was struck also by how you discovered the philosophy of history tradition in the origin of species. Now, if we wanted to put it a bit provocatively, we might perhaps say this philosophy of nature authors seem to get carried away sometimes a bit, but isn't it still a very fruitful, heuristically valuable tradition nonetheless? This is playing with your closing statement of saying you can't have it both ways.
Well, okay. If you're saying actually all these guys are doing is a continuation of the natural history tradition, and that's always been part of what they do. I don't disagree, but I think that it's why I say it's a bait and switch is that the authority, as I see it, the authority of science is based on its capacity to be value-free and objective, and then to smuggle values in at the end. At the same time, what I am wanting to say is what's interesting about these things is they have the genre that's precisely the same as what you see going right back, which is to try and invest meaning and value in the natural world. But the key thing is that what's missing is that what you find in Aristotle and Plato and Simplicius and the seven, there's a metaphysics that makes it reasonable to make that claim, but that metaphysics is absent from the mythological accounts of modern biology. So that's where again I would regard as inconsistent. So genealogically, as a genealogical story, it's interesting to trace this back and say, oh, it just looks like natural history. But the logic of the position where you end up is problematic because it lacks the metaphysical assumptions that these previously metaphysically rich traditions had that were perfectly compatible with the claims that they wanted to make. Is that
Okay, well, I've been standing here as a biologist and in total amazement that a human brain can function so well after 30 hours traveling in Australia. I think it's a remarkable achievement, and I think we do want to thank Peter very much for getting us off to a fine start.